April 29th, 1945. Dawn breaks cold over the Bavarian town of Lager Lechfeld. 23-year-old technician 4th grade Ichiro Imamura peers through morning fog at something that doesn't belong. Barbed wire, barracks, the silhouette of a watchtower against pale sky. His M1 carbine feels suddenly heavy. The smell hits him before understanding does. Death has a specific odor. He will never forget it. Imamura moves closer. His boots crunch on gravel. No guards, no movement. Then he sees them. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms huddled behind the wire. Some are moving. Barely. He raises his carbine and shoots the chain holding the gate shut. The metal shatters. The gate swings open. What walks out isn't quite human anymore. What stares back at him through hollow eyes is something worse than war. This is something else entirely. Imamura is Japanese-American. Born in California, raised speaking English and Japanese. His family's behind barbed wire too. Not here, not like this, but behind wire nonetheless. In a place called Manzanar, in the desert of California, where the American government put them after Pearl Harbor, where they remain while Imamura fights for that same government 6,000 miles from home. The irony is not lost on him. He is a liberator who knows what imprisonment feels like. He is an American soldier whose loyalty has been questioned since birth. And now he stands at the gates of hell, opening them for strangers who look at him and see another foreign face. Another enemy, perhaps, until they realize he is their salvation. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion wasn't supposed to be here. They weren't supposed to exist at all. In February 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. 120,000 people of Japanese descent were removed from their homes on the West Coast. 2/3 were American citizens. It didn't matter. Fear outweighed citizenship. Suspicion trumped the Constitution. They were given days to pack what they could carry. Homes were sold for pennies. Businesses abandoned. Lives dismantled. They were sent to camps in desolate locations. Manzanar, Heart Mountain, Tool Lake, barbed wire, guard towers, machine guns pointed inward. Japanese-American men were reclassified. From eligible for military service to 4C, enemy aliens, prohibited from serving. This was January 1942. The same men who'd been drafted in 1940 and 1941 were suddenly considered security threats. The same families who'd been Americans for generations were now the enemy. But war has a way of changing calculations. By 1943, the military needed bodies. Combat was consuming men faster than training could replace them. The question arose, could Japanese Americans be trusted to fight? The answer was carefully worded. They could volunteer for a segregated unit, under white officers. They would fight in Europe, never the Pacific. The assumption was clear. Blood loyalty would prevent them from fighting against Japan. The assumption was racist, but it created an opportunity. The call went out in January 1943. The response from Hawaii was overwhelming. 10,000 volunteers for 1,500 slots. The response from the mainland camps was different. Only 1,200 volunteers from the entire camp system. The difference was telling. In Hawaii, Japanese Americans hadn't been mass incarcerated. They hadn't had their loyalty publicly questioned. They hadn't watched their parents lose everything. Mainlanders had. Their hesitation wasn't about patriotism. It was about self-respect. On February 1st, 1943, the 492nd Regimental Combat Team was activated. The unit would include the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, approximately 650 men, almost all Japanese American. They trained at Camp Shelby in Mississippi. The segregation extended beyond race. Island boys, mainland boys, Buddha heads from Hawaii, Katonks from the camps. They spoke different dialects, came from different worlds. Initially, they fought each other more than they trained together. Then the mainland boys were granted leave. They visited the camps in Arkansas. Jerome and Roja, the Buddha heads, went with them. They saw the barbed wire, the guard towers, the machine guns pointed inward, the tar paper barracks where entire families lived in single rooms. They saw what their mainland brothers had left behind, what their mainland brothers were fighting for while their families remained imprisoned. The fighting stopped. The unit became a fist. Training intensified through 1943 and early 1944. Field artillery was technical, precise, unforgiving. The 522nd was equipped with M10 1A1 105-meter howitzers. Each gun weighed 2.5 tons. Effective range was 7 miles. Rate of fire was 3 rounds per minute sustained. 8 rounds per minute for short periods. The math was complex. Trajectories, wind speed, temperature, propellant temperature, barrel wear, target distance, target elevation. All had to be calculated in seconds. Under fire, the 522nd excelled. Japanese-American soldiers brought something unexpected to artillery. Many had backgrounds in science, engineering, mathematics, skills that translated directly to fire direction. They could calculate firing solutions faster than most units. They were accurate, devastatingly so. They developed a reputation. When the 522nd provided fire support, it arrived exactly where and when needed. In April 1944, the 422nd deployed to Italy. The 522nd went with them. They entered combat in June. The Italian campaign was brutal. Mountains, fortified positions, experienced German defenders. The 422nd fought at Monte Cassino, Livorno, the Gothic Line. They took casualties at rates that horrified observers. But they took their objectives. The 522nd provided fire support throughout. Their accuracy saved lives. Their speed allowed advances that would have been impossible with slower artillery. By October 1944, the 442nd was in France. The Vosges Mountains, ancient forest, steep ravines, dense undergrowth, weather turning cold, rain constant, visibility minimal. The 36th Infantry Division was pushing toward Germany. The 442nd was attached to them. They liberated Bruyères, then Bifontaine. 10 days of continuous combat. Casualties were horrendous. On October 23rd, they were pulled back for rest. They'd earned it. The rest lasted less than 2 days. On October 24th, the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment advanced beyond American lines. They were Texas National Guard, 275 men. They pushed 4 miles forward, occupied high ground. Then the Germans closed behind them. The Texans were surrounded, cut off, trapped. Artillery couldn't reach them. Supplies couldn't reach them. They became the Lost Battalion. 2 rescue attempts by other 141st Battalions failed. Casualties mounted. The Lost Battalion was running out of food, water, ammunition, time. On October 25th, General John Dahlquist made a decision. He ordered the 442nd to attempt the rescue. The Nice soldiers had been resting for less than 48 hours. They were under strength, exhausted. They went anyway. The rescue took 5 days. 5 days of the most brutal fighting the 442nd experienced. The terrain was impossible. The Germans were dug in, defending in depth, machine gun nests, artillery, mines everywhere. The 522nd fired continuously, providing support, adjusting fire by sound because visibility was too poor for observation. They fired until barrels were nearly worn smooth. Then they kept firing. On October 30th, the 422nd broke through. They reached the Lost Battalion. 211 Texans were still alive. The cost was staggering. The 422nd suffered over 800 casualties. Some companies were reduced to a handful of men. I Company went in with 185 soldiers. 8 walked out unhurt. K Company began with 186. 17 remained standing. The 522nd continued firing support throughout. Their ammunition consumption was unprecedented, but they never stopped, never faltered. The rescue made headlines. It became legend. The Nice soldiers who freed the Texans while their own families remained in camps. The irony was noted. The courage was undeniable. General George Marshall called them superb. Governor John Connolly made them honorary Texans. They received 5 presidential unit citations for the Vosges campaign alone. More would follow, but the war wasn't over. Not for the 522nd. In March 1945, the 442nd was reassigned. Northern Italy. The Po Valley Offensive. The final push to drive Germany from Italy. But the 522nd received different orders. They were detached from the 442nd, sent to Germany. Attached directly to the 7th Army, they would operate independently, supporting whatever units needed them. Moving fast, staying mobile, they became a roving artillery battalion, going wherever the fighting was heaviest. This was unusual. Artillery battalions normally stayed with their parent units. The 522nd was different. They'd proven themselves too valuable to keep static. Their speed, their accuracy, their ability to calculate fire solutions faster than anyone else. The High Command wanted them available. They wanted them mobile. The 522nd became troubleshooters, elite support that could be deployed anywhere on short notice. April 1945. Germany was collapsing. The Western Front was advancing rapidly. The Eastern Front was closing from the other direction. The Reich was being crushed between 2 massive armies. German forces were retreating, fleeing, trying to avoid capture by the Soviets, preferring to surrender to Americans or British. The speed of advance was unprecedented. Units were moving dozens of miles per day. The 522nd moved with them. They were part of the spearhead. advancing with cavalry and armor, ahead of infantry. This was extraordinary for artillery. They were designed to support attacks, not lead them. But the 522nd adapted. They moved at night, set up in darkness, fired at dawn, displaced immediately, were miles away before counter-battery fire arrived. They captured German soldiers, dozens, then hundreds. They overran airfields, liberated French POWs, did things artillery battalions weren't supposed to do. On April 28th, the 522nd reached Augsburg. They continued south, toward Munich. The advance was chaotic. German resistance was collapsing. Some units fought, others surrendered. Civilians were everywhere, refugees, displaced persons. The roads were clogged. The 522nd navigated through the chaos, moving southeast, following retreating Germans. April 29th, near Lager Lechfeld, a small town in Bavaria. The 522nd was scouting ahead, looking for enemy positions. They found something else. Barracks surrounded by barbed wire. Watchtowers. No guards. The scouts moved closer. The smell was overwhelming. Decay, disease, death. They realized what they'd found. A camp. A prison camp, but not for soldiers. This was Kaufering IV, a subcamp of Dachau, one of 11 such facilities. Labor camps where prisoners were worked to death building underground aircraft factories. Most prisoners were Jews, Poles, Russians, political prisoners. They'd been starved, beaten, worked beyond human endurance. Many were dying. Many were already dead. The 522nd soldiers broke open the gates. Inside were approximately 3,000 people. Calling them prisoners understated the horror. They were barely alive. Skeletons covered in skin, shaved heads, hollow eyes, striped uniforms that hung like shrouds. Many couldn't stand, couldn't speak, just stared. Some tried to smile, others wept. Many did nothing, just looked at their liberators with expressions beyond description. Imamura and his fellow soldiers were unprepared. Nothing in training covered this. Nothing in combat prepared them for what they were seeing. These weren't casualties of war. This was something else, something deliberate, something systematic. This was murder on an industrial scale. The soldiers had been trained to fight enemies. They hadn't been trained for this level of suffering, this depth of cruelty. The men of the 522nd shared what they had: food, water, blankets, medical supplies, cigarettes, anything, everything. They'd been ordered not to give away rations. They ignored the orders. How could you not? How could you see this and do nothing? Some prisoners ate too quickly. Their stomachs couldn't handle food after months of starvation. They died with full bellies. The soldiers watched helplessly, trying to save people and accidentally killing them with kindness. Hideo Nakamine was there. He remembered the suffering, the horror. He'd later spend his life documenting what they found, working with Holocaust education centers, ensuring the story was told. George Oye was there. He photographed the scene, built fires for survivors, gave them his coat, his gloves. He carried the guilt for decades, the feeling that he hadn't done enough, could never do enough. The 522nd couldn't stay. The war was still happening. German forces were still retreating. The unit had to keep moving. They reported what they'd found, called for medical personnel, left what supplies they could, then moved on. South, toward the Alps. Following the German retreat. The main Dachau concentration camp was liberated the same day, April 29, 1945, by units of the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions. The 20th Armored Division was there too. The liberation of the main camp was documented, photographed, became iconic. But the 522nd wasn't there. They were miles away, liberating subcamps, finding death marches, saving prisoners that history would nearly forget. May 2nd, near Waakirchen, south of Munich, deep in the Bavarian Alps. The 522nd Scouts found an open field. What they thought were lumps in the snow turned out to be people, hundreds of them, left to die of exposure. Prisoners from Dachau who'd been force-marched south. The SS guards had fled, just abandoned them, left them to freeze. The 522nd found them before they all died. Some were already gone, others were close. The soldiers gathered them, built fires, shared coats, called for help, saved who they could. Too many they couldn't. These were the Dachau death marches. Heinrich Himmler had ordered the camps evacuated as Allied forces approached. Prisoners were marched toward Austria, away from liberation. Many were too weak to walk. They were shot where they fell. Left by the roadside, others died of exhaustion, exposure, starvation. The marches were genocidal in intent. The goal was to eliminate evidence. to kill witnesses, to erase what had been done. The 522nd encountered march after march, field after field of dying prisoners. They did what they could. Soldiers who'd been trained to destroy gave everything they had to save. Soldiers who'd faced death in combat broke down seeing this level of suffering. Ichiro Imamura wrote in his diary that they weren't prepared for this, that nobody could be prepared for this, that seeing humans reduced to this state was beyond his ability to process. The prisoners looked at their liberators and saw Asian faces. Many had never seen Japanese people before. Some thought they were being transferred to different camps. Others thought these were Chinese soldiers or Mongolian. Few understood initially that these were Americans. American soldiers whose families were also behind wire. American soldiers who understood something about imprisonment, about being judged by appearance rather than action. Abanawa was one of the survivors. A teenage boy from Lithuania. He'd been at Kaufering. Survived the death march. Years later he'd speak about his liberation, about seeing the American soldiers with Asian faces, about not understanding who they were at first, about realizing these strangers had saved his life. He'd spend decades trying to find the men who liberated him, trying to thank them, trying to understand why they'd risked their lives for people they didn't know. The liberation wasn't clean, wasn't simple. Some prisoners died after liberation. Their bodies couldn't recover from months or years of starvation and abuse. Some died of disease. Typhus was rampant, dysentery, tuberculosis. The 522nd had no medical facilities for civilians. They called for help, did what they could. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. Other units arrived. Medical personnel, relief organizations. The 522nd moved on. They had orders. The war wasn't over. Germany hadn't surrendered yet. There were still German units fighting, still objectives to take. The artillery battalion continued its mission. But what they'd seen stayed with them, would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The 522nd continued operations through early May. They reached Hitler's Eagle's Nest at Berchtesgaden, photographed themselves at the Führer's mountain retreat. The symbolism was powerful. Japanese-American soldiers whose loyalty had been questioned, whose families had been imprisoned, standing at the heart of Nazi power, victorious. The photograph would become iconic, a statement about loyalty, about courage, about who Americans really were. May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The 522nd had been in continuous operation since landing in Italy 13 months earlier. They'd fired more rounds than almost any comparable unit, travelled over 1,100 miles through Germany, provided support for dozens of units, earned their reputation as the best artillery battalion in the 7th Army, and they'd done something else, something that wasn't in their orders, wasn't part of their mission. They'd liberated death camp prisoners, saved people from death marches, witnessed the Holocaust firsthand, became part of a story most Americans didn't know, that many still don't know. The official liberation credits for Dachau go to the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions, the 20th Armored Division. That's accurate for the main camp, but the Dachau system was massive. Over 100 subcamps, tens of thousands of prisoners. The 522nd liberated or aided several of these subcamps. They rescued death march survivors. They witnessed atrocities, but their role was minimized, overlooked, sometimes deliberately ignored. Why? Partly because they weren't the first into the main camp, partly because they were artillery, not infantry. Artillery doesn't liberate camps. They provide fire support, but mostly because they were Japanese American. And in 1945 America, Japanese Americans weren't supposed to be heroes. They were supposed to be in camps themselves. The cognitive dissonance was too great, so their story was downplayed, forgotten, lost in the larger narrative. The survivors didn't forget. Abanawa searched for decades to find the men who liberated him. Soligano did the same. They wanted to thank them, to honor them, to ensure their story was told. In 1992, a reunion was held in Jerusalem. 522nd veterans met the survivors they'd saved. Men who hadn't seen each other in 47 years embraced, wept, told stories. The survivors called the Nisei soldiers their angels, their saviors. The soldiers were humbled, embarrassed even. They'd just done their duty, just helped where they could. The 422nd Regimental Combat Team, including the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, became the most decorated unit in American military history for its size and length of service. 21 Medals of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, over 9,000 Purple Hearts, 560 Silver Stars, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 7 Presidential Unit citations. The numbers are staggering. The cost was equally staggering. Over 9,000 casualties from a unit that never exceeded 4,000 men at any one time. 300% casualties. Every man killed or wounded, then replaced, then killed or wounded again. And again. In 2000, President Bill Clinton upgraded medals for several 442nd soldiers. Medals that should have been Medals of Honor in 1945, but were downgraded due to racism. Barney Hajiro received his Medal of Honor posthumously. So did James Akubo. George Sakato received his in person. They'd earned them 55 years earlier. The recognition came late, but it came. In 2010, Congress awarded the 442nd the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor. Every surviving member received one. The ceremony was held at the Capitol. Thousands attended. Japanese-American families came from across the country. Some brought urns with ashes of veterans who hadn't lived to see the day. They placed the urns on empty chairs. The deceased were honored alongside the living. In 2012, France made all surviving 442nd members Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur, France's highest decoration, for liberating French territory, for saving French lives, for defeating France's enemies when France couldn't do it herself. The French didn't forget. They honored men America had tried to forget. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion fired their last rounds in May 1945. They'd been in combat for 13 months, lost dozens of men, saved thousands of lives, both through their artillery support and through their liberation of camp prisoners. They'd proved their loyalty in the most brutal way possible, through blood, through sacrifice, through doing their duty when their country had failed to do its duty to them. The technological aspect of their success is worth examining. The M101A1 howitzer they used was exceptional, reliable, accurate. The fire control systems were advanced for their time, but technology alone doesn't explain the 522nd's effectiveness. What made them exceptional was the men operating the equipment. Artillery requires mathematics, constant calculations under pressure. The 522nd had men with backgrounds in science and engineering. They could calculate firing solutions faster than most units. They understood the physics involved, could adjust for variables intuitively. This gave them an edge, speed, precision, lethality, but the real advantage was cultural. Japanese-American families valued education intensely. Many Nisei soldiers were college-educated, unusual for the era, unusual for enlisted men. They brought intellectual capability to a field that required it. This wasn't genetic, it was cultural. Values instilled by immigrant parents who'd sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities. The irony is profound. The very people America imprisoned produced soldiers who excelled through the education America provided. The 522nd's independence in the final months of war was another factor. Detached from the 442nd, operating autonomously, moving rapidly, supporting multiple units, this required initiative, flexibility, trust. The High Command trusted them to operate independently because they'd proven reliable. They always completed their missions, always provided accurate fire, never failed. This level of trust was extraordinary for a unit composed of men from a group officially designated enemy aliens just 3 years earlier. Their encounter with Holocaust survivors changed them. Every veteran who spoke about it mentioned the shock, the horror, the inability to process what they were seeing. These were combat soldiers. They'd seen death, caused death. Death in combat was comprehensible. This was different. This was systematic, industrialized, designed to destroy humanity itself. Many veterans carried trauma from this for decades. Some never spoke about it. Others spent their lives ensuring the story was told. The parallel between Japanese-American incarceration and the Holocaust is uncomfortable. One was not the other. The scale was different. The intent was different. American camps weren't death camps, but both were predicated on the same premise. That ethnicity determined loyalty. That appearance determined danger. That entire populations could be judged by the actions of others who looked like them. The 522nd soldiers understood this viscerally. They'd experienced the premise. They'd suffered under it. And now they were liberating people who'd suffered under its most extreme expression. This created a unique bond. Japanese-American veterans and Holocaust survivors shared something. They understood what it meant to be targeted for who you were, rather than what you'd done. They understood systematic persecution. They understood having your humanity questioned by your own society. This bond persists. Holocaust survivors sought out 522nd veterans, thanked them, honored them, called them angels. The veterans were uncomfortable with the praise. They'd just done what they could, just helped where possible, just acted with the humanity their own government had denied them. The weapons used by the 522nd were standard. The tactics were standard. What was exceptional was the men, their training, their dedication, their ability to function under impossible conditions, their willingness to continue fighting for a country that had imprisoned their families. This is what made them heroes, not the technology, not the tactics, the choice to serve despite being betrayed. Consider the mathematics of their service. The 522nd fired approximately 1 million rounds during their time in combat. Each round required calculations, trajectory, wind, temperature, target distance, propellant charge. Every variable had to be assessed, calculated, applied in seconds, under fire. While exhausted, while grieving friends, the mental strain was enormous. The physical strain equally so, moving the guns, digging in, firing, displacing, repeat, day after day, month after month. The cost in human terms was staggering. Every man in the 522nd knew someone who died. Most knew multiple people. The artillery battalion had fewer casualties than the infantry, but they saw the results of their work. They saw what their shells did. They also saw what German shells did to their fellow soldiers. They lived with both realities, the destruction they caused, the protection they provided. The weight of that knowledge stayed with them. The liberation of camp prisoners added another layer. These weren't combatants. These were victims. People who'd done nothing except exist as the wrong ethnicity, the wrong religion, the wrong political belief. The 522nd soldiers saw themselves in those prisoners. Different circumstances, same underlying prejudice. They gave everything they could, knowing it wasn't enough, could never be enough, but doing it anyway because it was right. The aftermath of the war brought its own challenges. The 522nd veterans returned home, some to families still in camps, others to families who'd been released but had nothing to return to. Homes sold, businesses gone, communities scattered. They returned as heroes to a country that hadn't wanted them to serve. They received medals while their families received nothing. No compensation, no apology, just release from camps to continue their lives as if nothing had happened. Many veterans struggled. Combat trauma, survivor's guilt, the specific trauma of liberating death camps, the realization that while they'd been fighting tyranny overseas, their own government had imprisoned their innocent families. The psychological burden was crushing. Some adapted, moved forward, built successful lives. Others couldn't, carried the weight until it destroyed them. The recognition came slowly, too slowly. It took decades for America to fully acknowledge what had been done to Japanese Americans, to admit the injustice of the camps, to honor the service of the 442nd and 522nd properly. By then, many veterans had died, never received the recognition they deserved, never heard their country apologize, never saw America acknowledge its mistake. But the survivors who were liberated remembered. They ensured the story was told. They honored the 522nd veterans, brought them to Israel, to Holocaust museums, made them part of the historical record. The soldiers who weren't at the main Dachau camp, who weren't officially credited with liberating anything, who just happened to find dying prisoners and saved them because it was human to do so. Those soldiers became part of Holocaust history, not through official channels, through the gratitude of the people they saved. In 2025, 80 years after the liberation, ceremonies are still held in Waakirchen, in Lager Lechfeld, in Bavaria, in Germany, at the sites where the 522nd found prisoners, where they saved lives. Survivors attend, fewer each year. Veterans attend, fewer still. But the story endures. The memorial plaques endure. The gratitude endures. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion existed for 3 years, active from February 1943 to August 1946. In that time, they changed American military history, proved that loyalty wasn't about ethnicity, that courage wasn't about appearance, that Americans were defined by their actions, not their ancestry. They did this while their families were imprisoned, while their loyalty was questioned, while their country failed them. They did their duty anyway, because they were Americans, because it was right, because someone had to. The technological superiority of American artillery was a factor in victory. The industrial capacity that produced endless shells was a factor. The training that created skilled crews was a factor. But ultimately, war is won by people, by soldiers who continue fighting when fighting becomes unbearable, who continue serving when service isn't reciprocated, who continue believing in ideals when those ideals are betrayed. The 522nd were those soldiers. Japanese-American men who believed in America more than America believed in them, who fought for freedom while their families lived behind wire. who liberated death camp prisoners while themselves being treated as prisoners of ethnicity. Ichiro Imamura's diary entry from April 29, 1945 is simple. He describes opening the gate, seeing the prisoners, realizing what he was seeing. Then he stops. The words end. What can you say? How do you describe encountering the depths of human cruelty while representing the heights of human courage? How do you process being both prisoner and liberator? Both suspect and savior? Both questioned and proven? The contradiction is too vast for words, so the diary just stops. The silence speaks louder than any description could. That silence contains everything. The horror of what was witnessed, the pride of what was accomplished, the anger at what was endured, the love for a country that didn't love back, the determination to prove worth that should never have been questioned, the sacrifice demanded, the sacrifice given, all of it, everything, contained in silence. The 552nd Field Artillery Battalion freed thousands of prisoners in Germany. That's the simple fact. But facts don't capture truth. The truth is more complex, more painful, more beautiful. These were Americans who served despite betrayal, who saved lives despite having their own rights violated, who proved loyalty through blood when words were insufficient, who believed in American ideals when America abandoned those ideals, who fought for freedom while experiencing oppression, who liberated strangers while their families remained confined. They did this not with some grand technological innovation, not with superior weapons or tactics. They did this with mathematics and determination, with education and courage, with humanity when humanity was in short supply. They did this by being better than the country that failed them, by honoring ideals that weren't honored in return, by proving through action what words could never demonstrate, that they were Americans, always had been, always would be. The gate Ichiro Imamura shot open in Lager Lechfeld is gone now. The camp is gone. The prisoners are mostly gone. The veterans are nearly gone. But what happened there endures. In memory, in documentation, in the gratitude of survivors who spent decades searching for the men who saved them, in the recognition that came too late for too many, in the ongoing effort to ensure this story isn't lost, that these men aren't forgotten, that what they did and who they were remains part of American history, part of Holocaust history, part of human history. They were artillery soldiers who became liberators, prisoners who became saviors, suspected traitors who became heroes, Americans who had to prove they were Americans, Japanese faces who represented American values better than those who questioned them, young men who carried burdens no one should carry, who saw things no one should see, who did things that had to be done, who remained human when humanity was tested beyond measure. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, 650 men, Japanese-American, second generation, Nisei, born in America to immigrant parents, raised in two cultures, fluent in two languages, loyal to one country that didn't trust their loyalty. They served that country in its darkest hour. They fought its enemies. They saved its allies. They liberated death camp prisoners. They proved through sacrifice what should never have required proof. They were Americans. They always had been. And they died proving it to people who should never have questioned it. Their story is uncomfortable. It reveals American failures, American racism, American injustice, but it also reveals American redemption. Not complete, not sufficient, but real. These men forced America to confront its contradictions, to acknowledge its mistakes, to recognize that ethnicity doesn't determine loyalty, that appearance doesn't define character, that Americans are defined by their actions and their principles, not their ancestry or their appearance. The 522nd proved this in the most brutal way possible, through combat, through blood, through liberation of prisoners while themselves being prisoners of prejudice. They opened gates at Dachau subcamps, but they opened something else too. They opened America's eyes, forced recognition that loyalty has nothing to do with ethnicity, that courage knows no racial boundary, that Americans come in all appearances and all backgrounds, that what makes someone American is belief in American ideals and willingness to defend them, not skin color, not ancestry, not appearance, action, principle, sacrifice. 80 years later, the lesson remains relevant, remains necessary, remains urgent, because prejudice endures, because ethnicity continues to be confused with loyalty, because people are still judged by appearance rather than action. The 522nd story is a reminder of what America can be when it lives up to its ideals, of what Americans can accomplish when given the opportunity, of what courage looks like when tested by injustice, of what loyalty means when it's questioned without cause. The weapons are obsolete now. The M101A1 howitzer is museum piece. The tactics are dated, but what the 522nd represented endures. Loyalty despite betrayal, service despite injustice, courage despite fear, humanity despite horror. These aren't obsolete. These are eternal. These are what separates civilization from barbarism. These are what the 522nd embodied, what they fought for, what they died for, what they saved, what they proved. In a field near Waakirchen, survivors frozen in snow were gathered around fires built by Japanese-American soldiers. In Lager Lechfeld, skeletal prisoners walked through gates shot open by men who understood imprisonment. In camps across Bavaria, people who'd been declared subhuman were saved by soldiers whose humanity had been questioned. The scenes were captured in photographs, preserved in testimonies, remembered by survivors. These are the moments that define humanity. Not the cruelty that created the camps, not the prejudice that imprisoned the soldiers' families, but the courage to save strangers, the compassion to share everything when you have nothing, the humanity to see suffering and act. This is what the 522nd did. This is who they were. This is what they represent. Their story isn't separate from American history. It is American history, the full complexity of it, the failures and the triumphs, the injustice and the redemption, the prejudice and the courage, the betrayal and the loyalty, all of it, together, inseparable, uncomfortable, necessary, true. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion freed thousands of prisoners in Germany. They did it as Americans, as soldiers, as liberators, as human beings who chose to act when action was required. They weren't supposed to be there. They weren't supposed to exist. Their families weren't supposed to be imprisoned. Their loyalty wasn't supposed to be questioned. But all of that happened, and they served anyway. They fought anyway. They liberated anyway. They proved anyway. They were Americans anyway. They were heroes anyway. They were human anyway. That's the story. That's the truth. That's what happened 80 years ago in Bavaria, when Japanese-American soldiers encountered Holocaust survivors and chose to act with the humanity both groups had been denied. That choice, that action, that humanity, that's what endures. That's what matters. That's what the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion represents. Not just military service, not just liberation, but the enduring truth that humanity transcends prejudice, that courage overcomes injustice, that loyalty can be proven even when it shouldn't need proving, that Americans are defined not by how they look, but by what they do, by how they serve, by what they sacrifice, by who they save when saving requires everything they have to give. The morning Imamura shot open that gate, 22 other members of his battery were spread across southern Bavaria. They were scouting, reconnoitering, looking for German positions, finding something else entirely. Staff Sergeant George Oye was with another group. They encountered prisoners on a death march, walking skeletons shuffling south. No guards, just abandoned. Left to die, Oye and his men stopped. Built fires, shared their K-rations, their coffee, their cigarettes, waited until medical help arrived. They weren't ordered to do this. It wasn't their mission. They did it because the alternative was unconscionable. Clarence Matsumura kept a Hershey bar from that day, carried it with him for decades. Never ate it, it was a reminder. He'd tried to give it to a prisoner. The man had taken it, smiled, died minutes later in Matsumura's arms, body too damaged to process food, to process kindness, to process liberation. Matsumura carried the guilt. If he hadn't given the chocolate, would the man have lived? Medical personnel later told him no. The man was dying regardless. But Matsumura couldn't shake the feeling that his attempt to help had hurt, that his kindness had killed. This was the psychological burden all the liberators carried. The desire to help, the inability to help enough, the knowledge that for many prisoners, liberation came too late. Minutes too late, hours too late, days too late. They were free, but freedom meant nothing to bodies destroyed by months of torture. Freedom couldn't undo starvation, couldn't heal disease, couldn't erase trauma, could only provide dignity in death rather than cruelty. The 502nd men understood this viscerally. They'd seen combat casualties, knew what death looked like in war. This was different. Combat casualties were soldiers, trained, armed, volunteers who'd accepted risk. The camp prisoners were none of these things. They were civilians, targeted for elimination, systematically destroyed. The 522nd soldiers saw the machinery of genocide firsthand, saw what happens when a government decides certain people aren't human, aren't deserving of life, aren't entitled to exist, and they saw themselves. Not in the camps, not exactly, but in the principle, the idea that ethnicity determines worth. That appearance justifies discrimination. that loyalty can be assumed rather than earned. The American camps weren't death camps. The comparison dishonors Holocaust victims to equate them, but the underlying philosophy was similar. Judge people by their group rather than their individual actions. Assume guilt by association. Imprison based on fear rather than evidence. The 522nd soldiers lived in this contradiction, imprisoned by America for being Japanese, fighting for America against Germany, liberating Jews imprisoned by Germany for being Jewish. The circular logic was dizzying. The moral clarity was absolute. Persecution was wrong, regardless of who did it, regardless of the justification, regardless of the scale. The Nisei soldiers knew this because they'd experienced it. Their families were still experiencing it. They fought anyway, liberated anyway, saved lives anyway. Private First Class Sasito was part of the artillery crew. Mathematics background, university education, could calculate firing solutions faster than anyone in the battery. He'd left UCLA to volunteer, left his family in Topaz internment camp in Utah, joined the army that had reclassified him as enemy alien, fought across Italy and France, earned a Bronze Star, multiple battle stars, Purple Heart, came home to nothing. His family had been released from Topaz, but they had no home to return to. No business, no savings, started over from zero. Ito would later become a biologist, work at Harvard Medical School, become renowned in his field. But in April 1945, he was a 20-year-old private calculating artillery trajectories and trying to save dying strangers in Bavaria. His grandson, Justin Ito Adler, would later speak about Suzito's experiences, about how he rarely discussed the war, about how the trauma stayed with him, about how liberating camp prisoners affected him for decades, about how he'd break down describing what he saw, about how he couldn't reconcile the horror with his understanding of humanity, about how he spent his life studying biology partly to understand how humans could do such things to other humans, about how the question had no answer. Science couldn't explain evil, could only document its effects. Technical Sergeant Hideo Nakamine had similar experiences. He entered a different subcamp. Conditions were indescribable. Bodies stacked like cordwood. Living prisoners indistinguishable from dead ones. The smell made grown men vomit. Nakamine and his fellow soldiers shared everything. Food, water, clothes, cigarettes, medicine. Weren't supposed to. Had orders not to deplete unit supplies. Ignored the orders. How could they not? How could you see human suffering on this scale and follow regulations? Years later, Nakamine would become an expert on Holocaust history, work with Holocaust education centers, provide testimony, document what the 522nd found, ensure the story was told. He felt obligated, felt he owed something to the people he'd helped save, felt that their story and his story were intertwined, connected by that moment in Bavaria when two persecuted groups encountered each other. One group near death, one group risking death, both targeted for who they were rather than what they'd done. The Kaufering subcamp system was particularly brutal. 11 camps total, built to provide slave labor for underground aircraft factories. The factories were being constructed in tunnels to protect them from Allied bombing. The prisoners did the construction, dug the tunnels, laid the concrete, installed the machinery, worked 18-hour days, fed starvation rations, beaten regularly, killed casually. The death rate was astronomical. Prisoners survived weeks, maybe months, then died and were replaced. When the 522nd found these camps, most were already evacuated. The SS had force-marched prisoners south, away from advancing Americans. Toward the Austrian border, some prisoners couldn't march, too weak, too sick. They were shot, left in the camps, or marched until they collapsed and then shot. The death marches were genocidal, designed to kill, disguised as evacuation. The guards would walk prisoners until dozens collapsed, shoot them, continue, repeat, leave bodies along the road. This is what the 522nd encountered. Roads lined with bodies, fields full of corpses, survivors huddled in forests, abandoned in villages, left to die of exposure. The soldiers gathered them, called for medical help, did what they could. It wasn't a planned operation, wasn't coordinated. Individual soldiers and small units finding prisoners and helping spontaneously. No orders, no guidance, just human decency in the face of inhuman cruelty. Lieutenant Susumu Ito was a forward observer. His job was spotting targets and directing fire. He was with advanced scouts. Ahead of the main unit, when they found prisoners on death marches, he organized assistance, called back to the battery, requested medical support, arranged transport, coordinated relief efforts. This wasn't his job. Artillery forward observers don't organize humanitarian operations. But someone had to, so he did. Years later, his son Daniel would speak about his father's experiences, about how Susito described the prisoners, how they looked at him, how they didn't understand who he was, how they thought perhaps he was another guard, another enemy, how he had to convince them he was American. He was there to help. How language barriers made this difficult. How some spoke Yiddish, others Polish, Russian, German, Hungarian, Lithuanian, a babel of languages from across Europe. How hand gestures and shared food communicated what words couldn't. How chocolate and cigarettes became universal language. How warmth and kindness transcended translation. The 522nd soldiers came from diverse backgrounds themselves: Hawaii, California, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Wyoming, from cities, from farms, from fishing villages, from plantations. They spoke English, Japanese, Pidgin. Some spoke multiple dialects of Japanese. They'd learned to communicate across these differences, to function as a unit despite diversity. Now they applied those skills to communicating with camp survivors, finding common ground, building trust, providing help. The artillery pieces they operated required teamwork. Each gun needed a crew of 11 men: gun chief, gunner, assistant gunner, 7 cannoneers, 2 ammunition handlers. Each had specific responsibilities. Each had to perform precisely. The guns weighed 5,000 pounds total when assembled, could be broken down for transport, towed behind trucks, set up in under 3 minutes by trained crews. The 522nd could set up faster, fire faster, hit more accurately than standard artillery units. This required exceptional teamwork, coordination, trust, communication. The same skills that made them excellent artillery crews made them effective rescuers. They worked together, coordinated efforts, divided responsibilities, maximized effectiveness. When they encountered prisoners, they organized spontaneously. Some built fires, others distributed food, others went for help, others stood guard, others provided first aid, others comforted the dying. They functioned as a unit even without orders, because that's what training does. Creates automatic responses, instills teamwork, builds capability that functions even in chaos. The M101A1 howitzer was a remarkable weapon, designed in the 1930s, modified through the early 1940s, achieved near perfection. It would remain in service for decades, used in Korea, Vietnam, by dozens of countries. The design was simple, reliable, effective. The gun could fire high explosive rounds, smoke rounds, illumination rounds. The crew could adjust for elevation, traverse, propellant charge, time fuse, point detonation, proximity fuse. Every variable could be modified to achieve desired effects. The Fire Direction Center was the brain of the battery. Officers and NCOs calculated firing data, determined gun elevation, azimuth, charge, fuse setting. They received requests from forward observers, calculated solutions, transmitted to gun crews. The process took seconds for experienced crews. The 522nd was exceptionally fast. Their mathematical capability, their training, their experience, all contributed to reaction time that gave them tactical advantage, allowed them to shift fire rapidly, support multiple units, respond to emerging threats, exploit fleeting opportunities. This capability made them valuable, made them trusted, made them essential. By April 1945, the 522nd was in such demand that keeping them with one unit was wasteful. They were detached, made independent, attached as needed to whatever units required artillery support. They operated with 4th Infantry Division, 10th Armoured Division, 12th Armoured Division, 14th Armoured Division, moved constantly, never stayed anywhere more than days, sometimes hours. They became troubleshooters, elite support that could be deployed anywhere, anytime. With confidence they'd perform. This independence was extraordinary. Artillery battalions normally stayed with parent units, provided dedicated support, built relationships with infantry they supported, learned their tactics, their preferences, their needs. The 522nd couldn't do this. They supported whoever needed them, had to adapt constantly, learn new units rapidly, coordinate with strangers, work with different procedures, different communication protocols, different command structures. They excelled at this because they had to, because excellence was the only way to justify their existence. Japanese-American soldiers faced constant scrutiny. Their performance was judged more harshly, their mistakes magnified, their successes minimized. They knew this, accepted it, exceeded standards, because meeting standards wasn't sufficient. They had to be better, always, had to prove continuously what white soldiers could assume, that they were loyal, capable, American. The burden was exhausting. unfair, necessary for survival, necessary for acceptance, necessary for redemption of families still in camps. This drove their excellence, fueled their determination, created units that performed beyond normal capabilities. The 100th Infantry Battalion earned the nickname Purple Heart Battalion, not because they received awards, because they suffered casualties at rates that shocked observers, but they took their objectives, always. The 402nd Regiment earned 7 presidential unit citations, more than any comparable unit, not through luck, through blood, through sacrifice, through excellence earned at costs that shouldn't have been required. The 522nd continued this tradition. They were artillery, less visible than infantry, less celebrated, but equally vital. Perhaps more so. Infantry couldn't advance without artillery support. Artillery enabled movement, suppressed enemy positions, destroyed strongpoints, provided cover, created opportunities. The 522nd did this exceptionally well. So well that by war's end, they were recognized as the finest artillery battalion in 7th Army. High praise, earned praise, paid for in exhaustion and blood, and then they found the camps. And everything changed. Combat was one thing, professional, technical, soldiers fighting soldiers. The camps were something else. Civilians murdered. Systematically, industrially, horror on a scale that defied comprehension. The 522nd soldiers were trained for war, not for this, not for genocide, not for encountering evil distilled to its purest form. They responded with the only tools they had: humanity, compassion, decency. They shared what they had, did what they could, stayed human in the face of inhumanity. 50 years later, in 1995, a play premiered, The Gate of Heaven, written by Lane Nishikawa and Victor Talmadge. It told the story of the 522nd Liberation, the encounter between Japanese-American soldiers and Holocaust survivors. The play toured, reached audiences across America. Holocaust survivors attended. 522nd veterans attended. They met after performances, embraced, wept, told stories. The survivors thanked their liberators. The liberators were uncomfortable with the praise. They'd just done what anyone would do, just helped where they could, just acted human, but that wasn't true. Many didn't help. Many looked away. Many participated in the cruelty. The 522nd soldiers chose differently, chose to act, chose to help, chose humanity. That choice matters. That choice defines who they were, what they represented, what they proved. In 1992, a reunion was held in Jerusalem. 522nd veterans traveled to Israel, met the survivors they'd saved 47 years earlier. Men who'd been skeletal teenagers were now elderly. Men who'd been young soldiers were now old. They remembered each other, not faces, not names, but the moment, the liberation, the kindness, the salvation. The survivors called the soldiers angels. The soldiers were embarrassed, insisted they were just doing their duty. The survivors insisted they were heroes. Both were right. Abernauer spoke at that reunion. He'd been 15 when liberated. Now 62, he described the death march, the cold, the hunger, the fear, waking up and finding the guards gone, then seeing American soldiers, Asian faces, not understanding who they were, thinking perhaps they were Chinese or Mongolian, then realizing they were Americans, Japanese Americans, soldiers who'd come to save them. He wept telling the story. 50 years hadn't dulled the emotion, the gratitude, the wonder that he'd survived, that anyone had cared enough to help. Solly Ganner was there too. He'd been at Dachau, survived the death march, been liberated by the 522nd near Waakirchen. He'd searched for decades to find the men who'd saved him. Finally succeeded, finally could say thank you, finally could honor the men who'd given him his life back. He brought his children, his grandchildren, wanted them to meet the men who'd made their existence possible, wanted them to understand that courage exists, that goodness exists, that even in the darkest moments, humans can choose light. These reunions became regular. Every few years, Jerusalem, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Hawaii, wherever 522nd veterans and Holocaust survivors could gather. The numbers dwindled. Death took both groups, but the meetings continued. The stories continued. The gratitude continued. The recognition that something extraordinary had happened, that two persecuted groups had encountered each other at a moment of maximum vulnerability. That one had saved the other, that both had been changed by the encounter. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion was deactivated in August 1946. The men returned home, some to California, some to Hawaii, some to other states. They scattered, built lives, started families, pursued careers, tried to forget the war, tried to process what they'd seen, tried to reconcile fighting for a country that had imprisoned their families. Some succeeded, found peace, built successful lives. Others struggled, carried trauma, suffered silently, died without finding resolution. The recognition came slowly. The 442nd received immediate praise, presidential unit citations, Medal of Honor recommendations, public acclaim. But the specific role in liberating camps was minimized, overlooked, sometimes deliberately suppressed. The official liberation credit went to other units. The 522nd's role was footnoted, relegated to obscurity. This was partly bureaucratic, partly political, partly racist. Japanese-American soldiers weren't supposed to be heroes, weren't supposed to have freed Holocaust victims. The narrative didn't fit, so it was adjusted, forgotten, lost. But the survivors remembered. They told their stories, insisted on recognition, documented what happened, contacted Holocaust museums, provided testimony, named their liberators, described the Asian faces, the kindness, the shared humanity. Slowly, recognition came. Holocaust museums acknowledged the 522nd. Exhibitions included their story. Memorials listed their contribution. The official narrative expanded to include them. In 2017, Israel honored the 522nd, a ceremony at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial. 522nd veterans attended. Few remained. Most were in their 90s. Some came in wheelchairs. Some needed assistance. All came with pride, with dignity, with the knowledge that their service had mattered, that their sacrifice had purpose, that their actions had saved lives, changed history, proved humanity. The memorial plaque installed in Waakirchen in 2025 marks where prisoners were found, where the 522nd built fires, shared food, saved lives. The plaque bears the battalion emblem, crossed cannons, and the 422nd emblem, an outstretched hand holding a torch. The symbolism is apt. Artillery and light, destruction and salvation, war and humanity. The 522nd embodied all of it. Were warriors who chose compassion, soldiers who chose rescue, fighters who chose mercy. The 80-year commemoration drew crowds, survivors in their 90s. 522nd family members representing dead veterans, German officials, American officials, Israeli officials, all gathered to remember, to honor, to ensure the story endures, that the sacrifice is recognized, that the lessons persist, that what happened in Bavaria in April and May 1945 remains part of collective memory, part of Holocaust history, part of American history, part of human history. The question asked at these commemorations is always the same. Why did they help? They weren't ordered to, weren't required to, could have kept moving, could have reported the situation and moved on. Instead, they stopped, stayed, helped. Why? The answer is always the same. Because they were human. Because they saw suffering and couldn't ignore it. Because they understood persecution. Because they chose to act rather than look away. Because it was right. But there's more to it. The 522nd soldiers understood something profound. They understood that loyalty isn't about ethnicity, that humanity transcends appearance, that justice requires action, that freedom must be defended, that persecution in any form diminishes everyone. They'd experienced this, lived it, suffered from it, and they chose to ensure others didn't suffer the same way, chose to act according to principles their government had violated, chose to be better than the country that had failed them. This is what makes their story extraordinary. Not just that they fought well, many units fought well. Not just that they were brave, many soldiers were brave, but that they remained true to American ideals when America abandoned those ideals. That they proved through action what America claimed in words, that all men are created equal, that justice should be blind, that loyalty is earned through action, not determined by appearance, that Americans are defined by their principles, not their ethnicity. The 522nd proved this in the most brutal laboratory possible, combat. They proved it through excellence under fire, through sacrifice beyond requirement, through performance that exceeded standards, through loyalty that shouldn't have been questioned. And then they proved it again. Through compassion when compassion wasn't required, through mercy when mercy cost them, through humanity when humanity was in short supply, through choosing to save strangers when they could have walked away. This is their legacy, not just military service, not just combat effectiveness, but the enduring demonstration that principles matter, that humanity persists, that courage includes compassion, that strength includes kindness, that warriors can be saviors, that Americans are defined by their actions, not their ancestry, that loyalty isn't about appearance, that justice requires equal treatment, that freedom demands defense, that persecution must be opposed regardless of who's being persecuted. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion existed for 3 years. In that time, they changed history, changed perceptions, changed what it meant to be American, changed what loyalty looked like, changed what courage required, changed what humanity demanded. They did this while being denied the very rights they fought to defend, while their families were imprisoned, while their loyalty was questioned, while their service was doubted. They did it anyway, because it was right, because someone had to, because America's ideals deserved defending, even when America failed to live up to them. That's the story. That's the legacy. That's what the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion represents. Excellence despite adversity. Loyalty despite betrayal. Humanity despite persecution. Service despite injustice. Courage despite fear. Compassion despite trauma. Action despite uncertainty. These aren't just military virtues. These are human virtues, American virtues, universal virtues. The 522nd embodied them, proved them, died for them, and in doing so, saved thousands of lives, changed American history, proved that ethnicity doesn't determine loyalty, that appearance doesn't define character, that Americans are what they do, not what they look like. 80 years later, that lesson remains vital, remains necessary, remains urgent, because prejudice endures, because persecution continues, because people are still judged by appearance, because loyalty is still questioned based on ethnicity, because freedom is still threatened, because justice still requires defense. The 522nd story is a reminder of what we can be, of what we should be, of what we must be, not just as Americans, as humans. The reminder comes from Japanese American soldiers who liberated Jewish prisoners while their own families were imprisoned, who chose humanity when humanity was tested, who proved loyalty when loyalty was questioned, who remained true to principles even when those principles were violated, who saved lives because saving lives was right, who acted because action was required, who were heroes because they chose to be,